Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz, and it's time we went on a bit of a scallydandle, isn't it? We haven't done that for a while. Apologies for that. And I've got one lined up to do about a tremendous book from Korea that I read like a month or so ago. But I've let that one be picked at the post by this one for reasons which will become apparent. Okay, because we are going on a scallydandle to ancient Mesopotamia through the book The Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, you know, when I do a scallydandle, what that's about is about reading things from authors from places other than my own, you know, countries other than my own. And, you know, sometimes there's a closer hand and sometimes they're a bit further away. This is moderately far away, but a very long way away in time, because we're going back like about 4,000 years to read this book. And it's our earliest extended work of fiction that we still have and can read. It's not necessarily the earliest that there was, but it's the earliest that we still know and can read now. And I picked it, of course, because in June we had Ancientsathon, and this was one of my two kind of key reads for that lovely idea of encouraging us to read things from before 1700. And thank you, Tori of Hufflepuff Discovery and Jennifer Brooks for giving me the extra impetus to do this and do this scallydandle. Now, always with these videos, I try to start by making sure we know where in the world we're talking about. And I have my trusty globe for this purpose. So, where is Mesopotamia? And obviously, it's not called Mesopotamia now. In fact, it wasn't at the time, which we'll come to. But if you see here, and if we've got that in, yes, we've got that in focus. Okay, this where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, that kind of come together, that area there, it's present day Iraq, plus a bit of Syria, Turkey, Iran, perhaps a corner of Kuwait. It's that, but essentially, if you think of it as being what would now be the present day territory of Iraq, you're in the right area. And why should you have heard of ancient Mesopotamia? Because you should have done, and probably you have, because you're all kind of well-informed people, aren't you? Obviously, the people who lived in ancient Mesopotamia didn't think they lived in somewhere called Mesopotamia. It's a name, comes from the Greek word for middle of rivers, because it's where the Tigris and the Euphrates, you know, came down to the Arabian Gulf. But it was the site of some of the most fascinating ancient civilizations, from you know, Sumerians through the Babylonians, all the way to the Assyrians. You know, if you're aware of that sort of thing. But what is so special about it, I suppose, is that it's one of the, to use a kind of old-fashioned turn of phrase, one of the cradles of civilization. Now, we might debate how civilized some of this is now, but, you know, things like cereal crops, irrigation, the wheel, urbanization, you know, towns and cities, and the use of numbers, maths, and writing. Mesopotamia was one of the few centres in the Eurasian continent where those things first happened. The others would be other river valleys, so Egypt, the Indus, and the sort of Yangtze Basin in China. Those are kind of perhaps where there were sort of parallel developments going on. This is something that I could really talk about for ages, but I won't. I'll stop. But if you want to understand better why those sort of developments happened in those places rather than other parts of the globe, read Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond. Popular kind of geography come history come science that explains that really well. But the biggie for us, I guess, is that this was an area that developed writing really early. Not only, and then having developed writing initially, because they were. If you first develop towns and urbanization, then you need trade, because you can't all be growing all your own food, and when you need trade, then you need ways of recording what you have and you don't have, and who things belong to and how much they cost and how many of them you've got. That gives you a reason to develop writing. And then once human beings have developed writing, of course, they start using it for purposes of pleasure and other kind of records, as well as practical ones. And the kind of writing that the Sumerians developed was cuneiform. So we're talking like kind of little wedge shapes that were pushed into either wax or into clay tablets. Well, of course, the brilliant thing about clay tablets is that they're relatively durable. So things that were written down on clay tablets have the potential to survive to this day in a way that things that might have been put in another medium, like a wax tablet, for example, or some form of papyrus or silk based paper, or leather, any of those things are less likely to have survived for say 4,000 years or 3,500 years or whatever. So that's why we still have the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I'm so glad we do. So, Uruk, which is the city in which Gilgamesh, the story of Gilgamesh, is set, in around, say, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, it may have had a population, we think, of 60,000 people. So, we're not talking a village here. We really are talking a city. And Gilgamesh was a legendary king, Sumerian king of Uruk. Now, he may have really existed, but obviously he's one of those kings that, like, by the time you get a couple of hundred years after he possibly existed, he's become this legendary figure of almost superhuman kingliness. And poems and stories and so on were told about him. And then somewhere around 1700 BC, a Babylonian poet, an anonymous Babylonian poet, collected together some of those existing stories and further kind of developed them and combined them and created what is now kind of like the standard version of the epic that we recognize. But there's different versions, and because they're on clay tablets, they're found in lots of different places, and in a sense this is a book that's had to be reassembled. But when they find a bit now, they can think, that's part of chapter 10, because they've got other bits, they can see how it fits. So although it's a bit of a mosaic, this has not been reinvented. You're finding definitely bits of the same book that different scribes over different periods had made fresh copies of, whether for a king's library or as a learning to write, learning to do good cuneiform and be a good scribe exercise. Yeah. Now, Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh story, carried on being read and enjoyed up to classical times, I guess. That's the sort of the last bit of a version that we know of being sort of referred to and surviving, but it was then lost to us completely. We had no parts of it until the 19th century, when archaeologists started digging up these clay tablets and set to translate them. And so our kind of first rediscovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh came from tablets that were excavated from the ruined library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king. All this story gives me great joy, as you can tell. But is it any good as a book? Yeah, that's the question, I suppose, that I should ask in booktube terms. Forget the history and archaeology. Is this a book worth reading? I found it much more accessible than I expected. It's, I guess, human personality is recognizably the same, even though the circumstances are very different, even from something that's 3,000-4,000 years ago. And the kind of stories that human beings enjoy hearing retold are essentially the same. So the joy is that we can connect, over that time through a work of literature. Now, I got some really good advice from Hannah of Hannah's Books about how to embark on reading Gilgamesh, and her advice was to read a kind of a more coherent version that pulls it together, that you could just sort of read cover to cover, and then maybe also go to a more literal translation that identifies all the different source tablets that one might kind of put together to reform this book. So I read the Stephen Mitchell version from 2004. Now, it's not a retelling. This is, as in reinterpretation. This is a English translation of the actual poem. But what he's done is he's taken the kind of the best preserved bits all the way through, and where there are gaps, and there are gaps still, we've perhaps got 3/4 of the whole now, he's papered over those cracks so that when you're reading it, it works as a coherent story. You get beginning, middle and end. And I thought he did a tremendous job. It was a real pleasure to read, and it felt like he also, although he made it coherent, he didn't take away any of the strangeness of it, any of the things that make it, a Babylonian work of literature, not a 21st century one. And he captured some of the poetic quality, what an epic poem felt like at the time. So with things like kind of groups of repeated lines and so on, and you can just imagine how those would have worked as poetic form. So what's the story? Why did I enjoy the story? Well, so Gilgamesh is this, as I say, almost sort of superhuman king figure. In fact, in classic kind of legendary king style, he's described as being sort of two-thirds god and one-third human. He's larger than life in every way. He's physically big, he's strong, but also he has very much a larger than life personality. And this is wearing out his subjects, basically, because he's all over the place, and in some ways he's a good king, but also he's just also a bit outrageous and troublesome and over energetic, and so the gods decide that they will make him a playmate that will match him in strength and vigor and handsomeness and personality, and that maybe that'll help him kind of calm down a bit. And so they make this person, Enkidu or Enkidu. I'm not sure which way around. I've seen two different versions about where the stress should be. There we go. And they come together, they meet, they have a bit of a fight, and then decide they're going to be best mates. They're friends, and I think lovers. It's not quite explicit, but they definitely love each other with a kind of a passion that goes far beyond that which they have in any of their relationships with women. They are a couple, a bonded couple. They have adventures. Those adventures ultimately lead to Enkidu's death. Gilgamesh is inconsolable, so inconsolable that he keeps the body and refuses to believe that he's really dead until a maggot comes out of Enkidu's nose. And then he has to admit, oh no, actually you're not going to come back to life, however much I invoke the gods and cry over you and make sacrifices. And so he's heartbroken, and to try and recover some meaning in his life, he goes off in search of immortality. More adventures ensue. Ultimately that fails. He has to kind of accept his own mortality, and that kind of brings the story in more or less to a close. So lots of plot, lots of characters, good stuff. Now I found myself wondering, it's got all the nice kind of fantasy, myth, religious bits in it, but it's quite well plotted, and there's definite character development in the Stephen Mitchell version. And I thought, can this really be true? So I went to the Penguin Classics edition. That's translated by Andrew George. He's a real scholar. He absolutely can read the original tablets in Akkadian. He can read cuneiform. His version brings together all the different bits that we have, the different versions of the standard story, but also some older poems about Gilgamesh, and alternate versions of the story, and puts all of that together. It was last updated in 2019 because they are still finding bits not necessarily newly excavated, but lurking in museums around the world, where they realise, oh no, that's another chunk of Gilgamesh, and we can translate that and fit it in so that we're filling one of those gaps in the mosaic of the full poem. So and that reassured me that no, Mitchell wasn't making any of this up. It's essentially it's all there. It's all there, including the homoerotic kind of subtext, as it were. So I read this kind of out of curiosity, I suppose, and but I would say that it is not solely of curiosity value. Put it that way. For two reasons. One reason is that although it was lost to us between, sort of shortly, well, for a good 1900 years, basically, it was lost to us. But it had already influenced other writers who weren't lost to us. So, it influenced the Bible, we think. It influenced Homer and other sort of writing in classical times. So it's part of the fabric, I suppose, of Western and sort of Central Asian literature. So that's one reason why it's not purely of curiosity value. But the other is that, it really is something that works as a story and works as a poem. So tell me if you've read it too. Tell me what your probably more learned opinions than mine about it, and recommend good translations. And if you've never read it, maybe give it a go.